So, this is meant to kind of be a rapid review and recap of the path the facial nerve takes, as well as the components that it contains. And then at the end, there are just a couple clinical correlations as well.
So, for the facial nerve, it starts by going in to the internal acoustic meatus. And at this point, it has all of the fibers it will have, which are taste, GVA, which is autonomic sensory, GVE, which is autonomic motor, branchiomotor, and GSA, which is somatic sensory. So it goes through the internal acoustic meatus into the facial canal, and then at a bend in it, it runs into the geniculate ganglion. And nothing synapses in this ganglion because all of the ganglions here are sensory ganglia. So it contains the cell body of all the sensory neurons, but there's no synapse. So right after the geniculate ganglion, there's a facial canal hiatus. So while the facial nerve continues through the facial canal, part of it breaks off. The greater petrosal nerve breaks off through the facial canal hiatus. It goes over top of the foramen lacerum, which doesn't go through that, and it goes over it and into the pterygoid canal. So then, in that pterygoid canal, the deep petrosal nerve actually comes up and joins the greater petrosal nerve, and together they form the nerve of the pterygoid. And then that big nerve enters the pterygopalatine fossa, and in that fossa is the pterygopalatine ganglion. And the taste and the autonomic sensory don't synapse here, they just pass through it. But the autonomic motor does. Those preganglionic parasympathetic fibers synapse there, and then they distribute to the lacrimal, nasal, and palatine glands by riding some branches of the trigeminal nerve. And then those autonomic sensory, those those sympathetic postganglionic fibers just continue down to the same place and are distributing to the lacrimal gland and the palatine and nasal mucosal glands by also riding branches of the trigeminal nerve. So basically, the whole point of that branch, the greater petrosal nerve going out of the facial hiatus, is to bring parasympathetic fibers to mucus glands and the lacrimal gland. That's the end of that nerve. So that's that one little branch. Then the rest of the facial nerve, which is in the facial canal still, goes sort of downwards through the facial canal. And towards the middle ear, it gives off a tiny motor, branchiomotor nerve called the nerve to the stapedius, because obviously it innervates the stapedius muscle. That's the only little branch there. The whole facial nerve continues, and then right before it exits that facial canal, it lets off one more branch, the chorda tympani. And the two types of fibers that make up the chorda tympani are the taste and the autonomic motor, the GVE fibers. And those are preganglionic parasympathetic. It crosses the handle of the malleus and goes into the infratemporal fossa. And it goes through there by going through a tiny canal in the middle part of the petrotympanic fissure. And so at this point, once it's in the infratemporal fossa, the chorda tympani joins the lingual nerve, which is a branch of V3, and rides with this nerve. So like I said, the two components of it are the preganglionic, parasympathetic, and taste. So those preganglionic, parasympathetic, they synapse in the submandibular ganglion. And so then those postganglionic parasympathetic neurons that just synapsed in the submandibular ganglion provide secretomotor innervation to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. So once you get from the submandibular ganglion, it's going to two subglands, submandibular and sublingual. The taste component of the chorda tympani actually still rides with that lingual nerve all the way to the tongue and mediates taste from the anterior 2/3 of it. Just an FYI, the lingual nerve provides general sensation to that anterior 2/3 of the tongue, but that is part of the trigeminal nerve. So then, after giving off that last branch, the facial nerve finally exits via the stylomastoid foramen. And from there, it gives off a couple of branches before it gets to the terminal branches, the first of which is the posterior auricular. And what makes up that nerve is some somatic sensory, some GSA, and some motor as well. The somatic sensory is pretty small. It just gives sensory innervation to the external auditory meatus and the exterior surface of the tympanic membrane, and then some skin on the back of the ear. But the branchiomotor component, like that motor nerve, supplies the occipitalis and some vestigial auricular muscles that are right above the ear there. And then finally, you have what's left of that facial nerve going into the parotid gland. So it's turning and going more towards the front and sort of finally meeting in that parotid gland. And at this point, it's only branchiomotor fibers. So it reaches that, kind of becomes plexiform. It makes all these branches in that gland and emerges out as 5 branches. And that supplies branchiomotor innervation to the muscles of the face and the neck and the front part of the scalp. And the names refer to the regions they supply, so we know that. It's them zebras be mad crazy. Temporal, zygomatic, buccal, marginal mandibular, and cervical. And these supply muscles of, yes, facial expression. Booyah. If you're still here, the clinical correlations of this is that inflammation of the facial nerve in the facial canal in that confined space will cause pressure on that nerve and can cause paralysis of the facial muscles, which is Bell's palsy. A lesion of the lingual nerve as it originates, which again is part of the trigeminal nerve, would affect only general sensation for the anterior 2/3. Remember, because the facial nerve does taste, but damage to the nerve distal to the point where it is joined by the chorda tympani, like once the chorda tympani joins it, if you have a damage to the nerve there, it would also block taste to the anterior 2/3 because it would mess with that thing riding with it, that the taste branch of the chorda tympani. And it would also mess with the secretomotor function of the submandibular and sublingual glands because those all are riding right next to each other. And then something else that's fun is that the stapedius and the tensor tympani muscles have a protective function, which is being innervated by the facial nerve. They limit excursion of the ear ossicles when a loud noise causes excessive vibration. So damage to those muscles and or denervation of those. So if you mess up that nerve to stapedius branch, it would impair that function.